Welcome to Principles of International Relations. In today's class, we will talk about arguably the most important topic, which we will kind of discuss in the coming decades, and that is environmental issues. But we are not kind of going into the science aspect of climate change, but rather kind of look at the political process. Why is it so difficult for countries to find agreements on these issues, even though most countries and most political groups would agree that this is an important topic which needs to be kind of discussed and needs to be solved globally. So we will kind of look at the process of decision making with the COP agreements, the international agreements on climate change. You might be aware of the Paris Agreement and others, but also we'll look at the difficulties in kind of compliance, in kind of aspects of uncertainty, incomplete information, and other key kind of aspects which help us understand why it is so difficult for us to find solutions for this kind of global problem and kind of saving the environment. I hope this will help us understand it, but also kind of makes us think how to change our approach to this in the future. So I hope you will enjoy the slides, and I will go right into it. Okay, thank you. Okay, here we are again with our class in environmental politics and international relations. I think this topic will occupy us at least for the next 50 years, maybe longer. So this is not something which is new, and even though it has been kind of brought into limelight with the Friday for Future movement as well as Greta Thunberg in the last couple of years, it has been around for quite a long time, and the urgency is becoming more higher and higher. But at the same time, we see a dissonance in terms of the level of urgency this topic is kind of commanding, and the level of action which we find, or commitments which we find governments and international actors are actually kind of putting on it. And so in a way, this should be an introduction to the kind of topics, the topic of the so-called the intergovernmental negotiations on climate change, so-called COP meetings, but also on the problems of kind of reaching a coherent understanding of it and reaching kind of commitments by the member states which are meaningful. So if we kind of think about this in terms of an outline, the key questions we should ask ourselves here is, who are the key actors and how do they engage in global environmental governments from a government perspective? And the second one is, does a wider participation in global environmental governance signal greater influence on the part of non-traditional actors? What do we mean with non-traditional actors? Well, basically, not just state government actors, but activists, non-governmental organizations, scientists, other groups which are just having like commanding a say in this very complex and multi-layered issue. And so what we can see, if you observe it a bit further, is that the tendency is to go away from the traditional state actors towards these other actors, which are better organized, more connected, and also have a louder voice in this situation than maybe, let's say, in other issues like conflict bargaining, etc. So just to kind of give you a little bit of an introduction, I would like to show you this kind of brief history of the climate talks. And the climate talks are not necessarily kind of the only action which is done on kind of combating environmental issues. But as an international effort, these are the kind of biggest events which are really kind of important to watch.
Yeah, so then you quickly show here. It could be. What is it? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So here, you can have come here and have a look. I don't know if you find it convenient, but we have this red thing here, that red trolley, which you could use for going around grocery shopping because it's but if you just prefer to just carry like this, it's okay, fine too. And then you can need to carry. Okay, so just let me know what I do. Yeah. Needs to be the. Oh, this is all luggage. Yes. Oh, this one. And these things, they don't have to stay there. They just
But they can.
Can I?
You don't have to. Then
Yeah, now you have.
I'm also.
Yeah. No, just that. Yeah, and Hardin is probably.
I'm still kind of This is,
Joe's forward.
oh, it's here.
Oh, thank you. Frieden, yeah?
So I felt that this kind of introduction is quite good in several ways. First of all, it shows the urgency of the topic, obviously, but I think you have been aware of this anyway. But it also shows the history of the development of the different COP conferences and the increased commitment of the countries within this. But at the same time, it also shows the limitations. And while the Paris Agreement of 2015 has been a real step forward, because it kind of created commitment and specific targets individual countries are committing to in a way which hasn't been kind of achieved beforehand. The United States is leaving of the Paris Agreement under President Trump, which technically didn't actually happen until a couple of weeks ago, or November, like in November 2020. But at the same time, it was heavily damaging the Paris Agreement, also because it kind of dampened the urgency of the action of the United States and other countries to kind of tackle this problem. So we could kind of more or less think about 4 years where there was less progress done, which of course then needs increased urgency in the next couple of years. So these kind of international negotiations have kind of been difficult, but we also do see the raising voice of scientists as well as activists within the role of this the environmental issue. So in a way, the first thing I would like to kind of highlight here is the states as actors in international environmental politics, and And despite all the other groups I mentioned beforehand, governments are still key actors. Why? Because with international agreements, they can kind of lead to a different level of commitment. And also, they have the strongest way of implementing decisions on the national level. So something which is really important is not just an international agreements, but also the implementation on the grounds on the national level. And the governments are the key actors who are involved. So they are voting, signing, and enforcing consequently these treaties, and therefore should be seen as the most important actors. National interests in some form play a critical role in international bargaining on any kind of topic, but also on the environmental issue. And therefore, these are very contested negotiations, which are not easy to kind of find common solutions for all the actors. The increased urgency, of course, kind of leads to more willingness of compromise. But at the same time, it also makes it harder and harder. The longer countries wait for finding a decision, it makes it harder to actually kind of come up with suitable measures to prevent a climate crisis. And so we shouldn't forget that if there is no good measures come up to, then this will be a crisis which affects each country and all people, not necessarily equally, but drastically. The other idea which is maybe important here is that we kind of generally see nation states as unitary actors. But in this situation, they are not unitary actors. There are multiple agencies, and these kind of agencies have very different interests. Just to take the example of Germany, Germany generally has a very strong Green Party and has been seen already since the 1970s at a certain level of green activism. But at the same time, it's also the country with a very strong car industry, which, excuse me, which actually seems very unwilling to transform and uses all its kind of political pressure to keep stringent climate change measures at bay and kind of reduce them, to water them down to minimum level. So we do have, in many countries, we have these different kind of aspects which work against each other, which make it again difficult to find comprehensive solutions. Another kind of key dimension which is important to understand is this kind of north-south relationship. What do we mean with north-south? Basically between developed countries and developing countries. And one of the issues here is that at the one end, the marginal return of optimizing industry in the developing countries are much higher than in the developed countries. So what do we mean here? Well, basically, you could make, if you make the industries in the developing countries more fuel efficient, you can optimize much more than you could in the developed countries. So this might kind of tempt some people to say that in the developing countries we should kind of encourage our efforts. At the same time, there's another argument which is really kind of strong and important, and that is that of course a lot of the reasons for the climate crisis are based on industrial and economic development in the western in the northern hemisphere, so in the rich industrialized countries, and that it would be probably unfair to punish the developing countries by kind of putting hard measures on them and maybe not enable them to develop even further, while at the same time still enjoying the kind of privileges from this kind of development in the northern hemisphere. At the same time, there are other issues which are really kind of problematic. For example, also funding specific issues. One of the examples could be around the Amazon rainforest, which is primarily in Brazil, but also other South American countries. In a way, this is from a global perspective, this is a huge asset the world has and should be protected by all means. At the same time, it is questionable whether the burden of protection of these kind of assets can only be left in the hands of an individual country, or whether this is a necessity to be kind of done on the international level as well. And all countries should kind of contribute to the preservation of our natural forests. So the biggest one is, of course, the Amazon, but you could also talk about other forests in Canada, in Siberia, in the Philippines and Indonesia. So we do have some really important, these are just some examples, there are many more, but these are kind of just examples where maybe a more comprehensive approach would be necessary. The other thing is then how kind of, in terms of the South, how can we do kind of link the protection and the development at the same time? So there should be the opportunity for less developed countries to develop, but at the same time also kind of in an environmentally sensible way. And that means probably would kind of lead to transfer of funds, the necessity of transfer of funds, which the wealthy industrialized North is not always willing to commit to. The other aspects are around about kind of waste disposal in southern in developing countries, and a kind of strategy which has been used by developed countries for quite a long time to just export their waste to countries where the regulations are less strict in order to kind of dispose it there. Of course, these kind of mechanisms might economically make sense, but at the same time, from an environmental standpoint, they're really catastrophic and should not persist. If we think about this, not just from the national kind of perspective, but also from the level of international organizations, then they are in a prime kind of position to coordinate and also kind of be in a role of leadership. And in a way, the United Nations with the COP meeting is trying to kind of take these organizational leadership. And it would also, in intergovernmental organizations, of course, have a unique situation because they can kind of broaden blur the border between state and non-state actors, bring them together and kind of find sensible solutions, including non-governmental organizations, including scientists and other the academic environment to find better solutions, which is suitable for a wider range of countries and not having a very narrow bargaining situation going in these kind of COP negotiations. So in a way, it is important, of course, for the international organizations to represent the collective will of their member states, not just influential actors, but overall the collective will. And by kind of adopting own agendas, being an agenda setter, including increasing the activities, they can actually, at the one hand, gain legitimacy for the mission, but also influence the decision making on the ground. One of the problems they have is that the resources, the funding of these international organizations often are not sufficient to cope with these kind of extended demands, and therefore they would need additional funding, which is very difficult to secure. So if we kind of think about what do we talk about when we talk about intergovernmental organizations, and we can in a global setting, and we can basically kind of make a distinction between two sets. The one is the organizations around the United Nations, like the UNEP, the UNDP, the FAO, and the World Health Organization. And the UNEP, of course, as the key kind of governance regime in order to kind of organize environmental coordination and facilitate cooperation. But at the same time, there are also other organizations we shouldn't keep out of sight, and that is these are the economic institutional variations. There's the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO. These organizations, they are actually quite powerful in kind of changing positions by by domestic actors. And in recent years, they have kind of included clauses on environmental sustainability of development, which have been proven to be very effective in kind of convincing countries that they have to take a more environmentally sustainable approach in their economic development. So these organizations are not to underestimate as well. And of course, the important aspect, and I kind of raised this already, is whether there should be some kind of global environmental facility for funding and international commitments to these, which are on a large scale, are only kind of are concerned with domestic issues, but rather also with international and environmental issues, like, for example, saving the Amazon and others. In a way, I kind of raised this topic about trade and environment already. So very often the more orthodox stand is that trade liberalization harms environmental equality and reduces the power of regulation, and therefore reduces the level of environmental kind of protection if trade regulations are reduced. But is this really something, is this a necessity? Can environmental treaty regimes not kind of have trade rules which are compatible with environmental concerns on the domestic level? And so I think that what is necessary here is that trade regulations should not only include issues of trade, but also kind of increasingly have environmental concerns in their mind. And so a combination of those can become a very powerful kind of decision-making modus. If you are kind of thinking, as I mentioned before, a really, really important role in environmental issues is taking the global movements and the civil society. And here you have a picture of Greta Thunberg on the right, this young girl, which is kind of galvanizing so much of the environmental efforts in terms of the civil society. Shows how important this is in the public minds, but also how important civil society is in order to kind of create agenda settings and create kind of feasible solutions. The combination of scientific activity and civil society, which is pushing environmental activism, which is pushing the agenda forward, is very important in order to kind of move political parties and therefore kind of move the positions of countries as well. Having said that, in the actual kind of decision making around the COP negotiations, their role is not as dominant. And in times like the COVID pandemic, for example, it is very hard for civil society to, on environmental issues to come through and get their voice heard if other pressing issues are there as well. So in this way, it's not possible to kind of rely on environmental activism alone, but it should play an important role, and it should also be kind of incorporated in the kind of international decision-making process. In a way, of course, if we talk about a global civil society, we are not talking about one organization or maybe even a couple of them, but rather kind of you have to use this as an umbrella term in which the activist groups are able to at the one hand kind of have a domestic level of understanding, but then also kind of already connect on an international level in order to raise awareness and also connect these issues in terms of human rights, equality, justice, and environmental issues in order to kind of find a more comprehensive understanding of the topic, but also of the problems ahead. Another role or a group of actors which is very often underrated is the idea of private sector. Private sector is often seen as opposed to environmental issues because it could be a hamper for their enterprises and kind of increased regulations, which is not liked by some private actors. But we do find a new industry, and quite entrepreneurial industry, which is not only seeing the environmental issues as limitations, but as opportunity. So maybe the poster kind of company for this is a Tesla, which kind of on the basis of environmental issues tried to develop an electrified car, which is now a major player on the international stage, and kind of used not focused primarily on the limitations by environmental issues, but rather kind of the opportunities of this. And so we can see that there is a kind of a new industry coming up, which is a kind of actively embracing environmental stance and becomes an engine of environmentalism rather than a blocking group. And I think this is important in any kind of decisions to take them on board as well and kind of help these industries, because at the one hand they make it easier for governments to embrace environmental issues, because they don't have to be so worried about economic loss and unemployment, and kind of take this into a maybe a green economy rather than kind of opposing environmental issues and economic issues. I mentioned a couple of times already expert groups, and scientific experts are really important because they are providing, of course, the factual basis to understand climate change and to understand how global warming is leading to environmental problems and what kind of solutions are there to combat it. So they are really at the center of the discussion, not necessarily as for making political decisions, but rather for framing the solutions and driving the feasibility of these kind of issues. In a way, it is not necessarily very productive to see scientists at the one hand as political activists, or at the other hand as kind of enemies in these kind of situations. Scientific research needs by definition to be neutral and kind of tries to understand what developments are taking place and how to combat them, rather than kind of taking political stands. So a segregation between the political decision making and the scientific advice is really important. At the other hand, it's at the essence to understand the message scientists are giving and to enable them to help finding good solutions. If we kind of shed a little bit of light on the ideas of transnational climate governments, then we do see that that there are that transnational relations shape outcomes and process of international negotiations. So they are really important in the aspect of kind of not just understanding the issues, but also how sub and state actors seek to reduce greenhouse gases, how we can kind of find activities in order to reduce our output. But one of the problems is that they are largely relying on voluntary measures. And this is kind of problematic because it is questionable whether these measures are reaching the scale and scope of the level of the ambition, but also the level of necessity, what has to be done in order to kind of combat climate change. And also the role of the public and private sector, the legitimacy of governments beyond the state and north-south dimensions are kind of unresolved issues, which don't necessarily create an environment where solutions are straightforward. So lots of work is still kind of, even though governments and transnational governance is ramping up and becoming more powerful. These problems are not solved yet, and need to be solved relatively quickly in order to have a comprehensive approach towards global warming and climate change. The question here is, of course, how can we kind of explain this? And one of the aspects is to see this as a whole bargaining process, which is on an interest-based level. Yeah, so kind of that basically kind of national interest players are focusing on domestic factors that shape their country's position. So if they are kind of specifically kind of driven by car industry, they might have one position. If they have the capacity to produce large quantities of renewable energy, they might have a very different position, etc. But in a way, this approach is a little bit flawed, because a parsimony, as I mentioned before, a parsimonious view on countries' preferences is very unlikely. We do have many different, as I said in the example of Germany, we do have very different kind of perspectives on climate change and kind of different necessities, which make it a less coherent approach within each country, which then again makes it even more difficult to find solutions. But this is also something that preferences can change if domestic characteristics change. For example, for a very long time, Japan has been in the forefront of environmental issues, trying to kind of push towards more environmental friendly forms of energy and reducing energy, etc. But with the Fukushima nuclear catastrophe, of course, this kind of led to a situation where there was a real shortage of energy within Japan, and because of the gap which was normally kind of filled by nuclear energy, and that makes it really problematic in kind of acting coherently and in a long-term perspective, because preferences can change around these levels as well. The bargaining process in itself it can also be a potential source for change if the actors are changing as well. So if we kind of if we expect that there's a parsimonious view of countries' preferences in international relations, probably this is flawed in itself. So we do see this potential of change, domestic characteristics change, but also the actors in the bargaining process change themselves. You could just see like how different political actors are kind of becoming different. Like, for example, with the election of President Trump, the environmental policy of the United States changed quite drastically. In a way which kind of put, of course, the whole kind of climate discourse on an international level, of course, as well. So we do have to see that this is not a static process which we can kind of see as optimization on issues, but rather a very dynamic one, which is difficult to resolve and needs to with continuous kind of dialogue to resolve it again and again. I want to highlight here the last thing, this idea about collective action problems. So Eleanor Ostrom's work on the behavioral approach of rational choice theory and collective action from 1997. It's quite an old piece of work, but it's really eminently important for environmental issues. And what we do see here is that collective action is difficult to kind of understand as a from a bargaining perspective. And one of the issues here is that we are talking in terms of environmental issues, we are talking about a so-called public good. That is something which can be enjoyed by everybody, but at the same time, it has the costs are kind of spread between the different actors. And so because it is non-exclusive, that means we can actually not exclude certain actors from it. There is a tendency to have overconsumption of these kind of goods. And with the protection of the environment, this is especially important because it leads to a situation where generally kind of many people might agree with the protection that needs to take place, but the individual action or the individual willingness to take action is limited. One of the aspects here is to kind of transform this kind of public good in a private good. And that is something which has been pioneered by the Kyoto Protocol, where you could actually kind of basically buy licenses to pollute and also share them and trade them internationally. There is also the kind of environmental approach within Europe. It's also based on this kind of trading of environmental assets. But generally, the idea here is that somehow targets have to be met and kind of agreed on the individual actors, and then which must be benefit and kind of cost if these targets are not met. And so in this way, this is one of the key approaches in terms of collective action, not just to understand why it is still difficult to find comprehensive measures, but also understand that a transformation from a public good in some form of a private good might be very beneficial in order to kind of reach better results on the environmental protection. So that's it for me for this class.